Tonight we are continuing through the life of David, and we have about 3.5 chapters that we're going to work through this evening, starting in chapter 13, and we're going to work through 16, 14. Last week we saw the height of David's kindness as he welcomes Mephibosheth into his table to show kindness to Jonathan's son. But then we also saw David's failure with Bathsheba, and Nathan confronted David with a message from the Lord and told him the discipline that David was going to experience. And that included the son that Bathsheba was pregnant with would die, but then also the sword would never leave David's house. And so now we are going to get right into the sword in David's household. And this week has some very intense stuff. Like right as we're jumping in chapter 13, we're going to see Amnon and Tamar and his rape of his half-sister. But then we're also going to see Absalom, David's son, planning to eliminate Amnon and then start working his plan to drive David away from the throne and try to usurp the throne. And so it really does hit pretty quickly a downhill tread for David's reign here. But if this is your first time in these passages, rest assured, David, he will get back to the throne. So we're going to leave him today, and he's still going to be in exile, but he will be restored. But that is its own sad story as well. So chapter 13, we're going to start in verse 1. And in our English translation, it says, "In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David." Now, the reason I say in our English translation, it says this is because in Hebrew, Absalom is actually listed before Amnon and Tamar. And that is important for us to recognize because the writer is trying to tell us, like, this story, Amnon is not the major player in this story. What he does is despicable and awful, but we are making a transition to focus on Absalom. And so that's part of why the Hebrew translation has that order of names. Why the English translations switched it around is mainly for readability in English. And so they're not trying to tamper with the text. They're trying to give us a readable translation. And so that's just something I wanted to throw in as a note for us. And I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I'm not. I know enough Hebrew to be dangerous, and so I don't try to dive too deeply into Hebrew. But I thought that was an important thing to just note. Like sometimes the original language is giving us a clue for what we should be looking for, and so when that happens, I'll try to highlight it. So, verse 2. Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. Now Amnon had an advisor named Jonadab, son of Shimea, David's brother. Jonadab was a very shrewd man. He asked Amnon, "Why do you, the king's son, look so haggard morning after morning? Won't you tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I'm in love with Tamar, with my brother's Absalom's sister." "Go to bed and pretend to be ill," Jonadab said. "When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight, so I may watch her and then eat it from her hand.'" So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, "I would like my sister Tamar to come and make some special bread in my sight, so I may eat from her hand." David sent word to Tamar at the palace, "Go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him." So Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the bread in his sight, and baked it. Then she took the pan and served him the bread, but he refused to eat. Send everyone out of here, Amnon said. So everyone left. Then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food here into my bedroom so I may eat from your hand. And Tamar took the bread she had prepared and brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom. But when she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, come to bed with me, my sister. No, my brother, she said to him, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where would I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you. But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than her, he raped her. Then Amnon hated her with intensity, with an intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, get up and get out. No, she said to him, sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me. But he refused to listen to her. He called his personal servant and said, get this woman out of my sight and bolt the door after her. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. She was wearing an ornate robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornate robe she was wearing. She put her hands on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went. Her brother Absalom said to her, has that Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet, for now my sister, he is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart. And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. When King David heard all this, he was furious. And Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. So this is an awful story. And there are elements in it, like as we just read through, that's like, why would he want to do this? Why would he think any of this is okay? And there's so many like just bad decisions piled upon bad decisions. But there's also some cultural things that we should note. Now, David had multiple wives. And so Amnon and Tamar were half siblings. The law tells the people not to sleep with their sisters in the Old Testament. Like that was one of the laws. But the half sister in this culture did have a degree of separation because they weren't from the same mother. And so even Abraham and Sarah is technically Abraham's half sister. And so when David went into all those different places in Egypt and with Abimelech and said, she's my sister, he wasn't lying. He just wasn't telling the whole truth. And so there is, in this culture, there was less taboo around marrying your half sibling. And even Tamar, it says, like, ask the king and he would bless us to be married. And so she's like, it doesn't seem like she wants any of it, but she also doesn't want to be disgraced by her brother. And the disgrace is the rape is the disgrace, not marrying her brother, half brother. And so this passage, it's all very troubling. And in our sensibility, it's even more troubling because even a half sibling is like, no, don't even do that. Like that's all wrong. It's all bad. But there is a little bit of a cultural divide between then and now around this issue. Now, the problem though is Amnon is so obsessed with her that he makes himself sick. Like he is desiring a sinful relationship and he is obsessing over it. And one of the things that we should recognize is that sin breaks everything and it even breaks ourselves. And even before Amnon does anything to anybody, he is rehearsing in his mind what he wants to do, and it is upsetting him. And so he has this advisor, Jonadab, who is his uncle, cousin, And he has this idea like, well, just lie, get what you want by lying, and pretend to be sick and have the king send Tamar because you want specific recipe, a meal that she's so good at making, or that, like, there's all kinds of ways that he could spin this to make it sound totally innocent, and something that a sibling helping another sibling. And so his cousin tells him to do this, and he's like, I'm all right, I'm on board. And it all goes to pass. He calls up David because he's sick. He says, the king comes, and he's a father. He wants how can I help you, son? I was like, I'll send my sister to make this special bread. And so the king is like, okay. What's the king supposed to think? Right? And even here, when we read it, it's like, so I can eat it from her hand, is not like, it wouldn't read to David like I want her to feed it to me, as much as like, I want her to make it. I want it a handmade meal, is more what it's supposed to sound like. And so David's like, great. But what Amnon wants is like, I want to eat it from her hand. And like, he's gross. He's a gross dude. He's awful. And so he does all these things, and she makes it, and it's like, all right, the food's ready. And like, all right, everybody leave. And so, just as a warning to anybody now or in the future, if you're ever with somebody and they want you to, like, they demand that everybody leave, you should count yourself among everybody. Like, I'm also going to leave. I'm not going to be alone with you. I don't trust you. As part of my, like, there's this thing called the Billy Graham rule, where, try to never be with somebody of the opposite sex. And that is a good principle for protection, like, just to like eliminate any appearance of wrongdoing. But at the same time, like, in the work that we do, like as pastors and in the gospel, and there's going to be times where it's like, I can't like remove myself from the situation, like in this ministry moment. And you have to be very cautious, but also remembering that the person that you are with is your sibling in Christ. Like, don't be Amnon. like too many pastors, and male pastors in particular, like, they blame their lust on the woman. It is not the woman's fault that the man has a lust problem. It's not Tamar's fault that Amnon is messed up. And so that's part of the work that we have to do, is go beyond the Billy Graham rule to say, no, just love them like a brother or sister in Christ, and don't look at other people as somebody that you can take advantage of for your self-gratification. And that's all Amnon is considering here, is how can I please myself? And he takes her and he rapes her, and then he despises her. It's not about love. Like, even, Tamar offering a solution, like, let us get married. Let's make this a legit relationship. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want legitimacy. He just wants to fulfill his lust. And when it's over, he despises her, sends her away, and she is distraught at that as well, because now she is disgraced. And like, the way the writer talks about, like, she wore these ornate robes. These were gifts from the king to his virgin daughters, as a way to like showcase their beauty, their purity, all of these different things. And like, she comes away, she covers her head with ashes, she rips her robes, which is a sign of mourning. Like, she is distraught. And so Absalom, her biological brother, same mom, same dad, sees her distress, knows it's Amnon, and brings her into his household. And he promises to care for her. And the tragedy here is, David heard about all this and was furious. And he stopped there. Because Amnon is next in line. Amnon is the next to be king. David most likely feels trapped. Like, I can't discipline the next king. I can't execute. Like, what he did is grounds for execution. And he's unwilling to bring justice to the situation, most likely because he's the next in line to be king. And so David is furious, but does nothing. But Absalom begins to build a scheme, and his hatred for Amnon leads him to what we'll read next here in this section, because it's some time that he schemes and plots. Because verse 23. 2 years later, when Absalom's sheep shearers were at Baal Hatzor near the border of Ephraim, he invited all the king's sons to come there. Absalom went to the king and said, "Your servant has had shearers come. Will the king and his attendants please join me?" "No, my son," the king replied, "all of us should not go. We would only be a burden to you." Although Absalom urged him, he still refused to go, but gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon come with us." The king asked him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom urged him, so he sent him with Amnon and the rest of the king's sons. So this sheep shearing is a celebratory time, because this is, it's an opportunity to like do the work of shearing the sheep, but then also selling the wool. And so there would be feasts, there would be parties, all kinds of things, because it's like a big community event as part of this celebration. So Amnon, as a landowner with some flocks, like, this is an opportunity for him to celebrate. And he's like, probably is more than just saying, "I'm having sheep shearers." Comes like, "I'm having a great year. I've got a lot to celebrate." And he invites David and all of his family to come and celebrate with him. And I don't know if at this time Absalom was thinking as a way to eliminate even David at this point, because David was furious and did nothing. And Amnon, for 2 years, lived without consequences for his actions. And so we don't know, but it's one of those things. But David is not wanting to go. And it might be that David doesn't really trust Absalom right now. He knows Absalom's super angry. Like, he's just like, "I'm not going to go to that." Or maybe he's just an introvert. It's like, "Nah, not for me." "Thanks for inviting me, but no thanks." As an introvert myself, that's one of the things where it's like, "Yeah, invite me to your party. I probably won't go." Just like, I appreciate the thought. So he's making this whole plan. And but then when David gets a little suspicious, is like, "Well, why not send Amnon?" And David knows what Amnon did. David knows Absalom's upset, but he's like, maybe 2 years has gone by. Maybe that's long enough. And so he allows Amnon to go and with the rest of the king's sons. And the story continues. Absalom ordered his men, "Listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave." So Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Then all the king's sons got up, mounted their mules, and fled. And so he, in giving this order to strike Amnon down, he is like telling, it seems like there is a hesitance here. He's like telling them, "I have given you this order. Be brave, be strong." And he's basically saying, it's going to come back to me, not to you. It's my order. I'm the general of my servants, is basically what Amnon is saying, or Absalom is saying here. So they do it, and all the king's sons run away on mules, which is not very fast. Like, have you ever seen somebody ride a mule? Like, this is not the fastest animal, but it was a very common means of transportation. Verse 30. While they were on their way, the report came to David, "Absalom has struck down all the king's sons. Not one of them is left." The king stood up, tore his clothes, and lay down on the ground, and all his attendants stood by with their clothes torn. Then Jonadab, son of Shimea, David's brother, said, "My lord should not think that they killed all the princes. Only Amnon is dead." This has been Absalom's express intention ever since the day Amnon raped his sister Tamar. My lord the king should not be concerned about the report that all the king's sons are dead. Only Amnon is dead." Meanwhile, Absalom had fled. Now the man standing watch looked up and saw many people on the road west of him coming down the side of the hill. The watchman went and told the king, "I see men in the direction of Horonaim on the side of the hill." Jonadab said to the king, "See, the king's sons have come. It has happened just as your servant said." As he finished speaking, the king's sons came in wailing loudly. The king too, and all his attendants wept very bitterly. Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. But King David mourned many days for his son. After Absalom had fled and went to Geshur, he stayed there 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. So the sons run away, and the first news that comes to David is, all your sons are dead. And then Jonadab, the guy who gave Amnon the advice on how to get his sister, Jonadab says to David, "No, it's just Amnon's dead." This dude is the worst. He's here as an advisor to the king, and like he knows Absalom's scheming, but also all of this is happening because of Jonadab's advice to Amnon. The guy is the worst. Like, he's awful, and so he's trying to comfort the king. He's like, "Yeah, you heard all your sons are dead, but it's just Amnon because of the rape that he did and that you did nothing about." And when David hears all of this, like, this probably would have washed over him with Nathan's words from the Lord that the sword will never leave your house. And this is the first evidence of that. The sword has come, and his sons are in danger and maybe dead. And so when the watchman sees these people coming down the hill, that brings a little bit of comfort. Not all my sons are dead. And there is great mourning and weeping and sorrow. But it is still brother killing brother. Amnon is dead. Absalom now is next in line to be king. But he's also a murderer. So he runs away, and he runs to Geshur, which is a neighborhood just kind of on the north end of the land. And they have a good relationship between David and the king of Geshur. This is also Absalom's grandfather's king, so Absalom's mother is from the kingdom of Geshur. And so he's going home. There's a political alliance because of this wedding, of this marriage already. And so, this is the safest place for him to be. It's up kind of by just east of the Sea of Galilee. And so David can't really go and attack to try to get Absalom because of this alliance that he has. Like, he would go to war, and many hundreds of people would die. And so he's kind of in this very difficult situation. And here, 3 years go by. And David is mourning the loss of Amnon, the loss of Absalom. And while it doesn't say in the text, I wonder if he is also thinking this whole time, like, I could have done something to prevent this. Like all of this is coming back down to, like, I should have done something 2 years before this. Like, I let it go too long. So he is mourning. Joab is going to intervene here in chapter 14, and this is one of the longest sections that we're going to look at tonight. But earlier, David was confronted with his sinfulness through a story, and Joab is going to also employ a story. So they know how to talk to David in a way that he will listen, because David is a man who wants justice. Verse 14. Joab, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa and had a wise woman brought from there. He said to her, pretend you are in mourning, dress in mourning clothes, and don't use any cosmetic lotions. Act like a woman who has spent many days grieving for the dead. Then go to the king and speak these words to him. And Joab put the words in her mouth. When the woman from Tekoa went to the king, she fell with her face to the ground to pay him honor. And she said, help me, your majesty. The king asked her, what is troubling you? She said, well, let me pause there. The king was like the final arbiter of justice. He was like the Supreme Court, basically. Like, to get to the king, you would have had to go through several levels of appeals for justice. And so what he says is the ultimate decision. Like, you can't go to another king. Like, he's it. And so she, by getting to his presence, has already exhausted the levels of justice that she's trying to get to. All right. And so, what is troubling you? She said, I'm a widow. My husband is dead. I, your servant, had 2 sons. They got into a fight with each other in the field, and no one was there to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant, they say. Hand over the one who struck his brother down, so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. Then we will get rid of the heir as well. They would put out the only burning coal I have left, leaving my husband neither name nor descendant on the face of the earth. The king said to the woman, go home and I will issue an order in your behalf. And so the problem here is they are fighting in the field. And there is a law about any kind of manslaughter or death that happens in a field. Like, there's laws in the city where there should be witnesses, and then there's laws in the field. And like, if nobody was a witness. And so we don't know all that went down. We just have the survivor's story. And they were fighting and got out of hand, and one of the brothers is dead. And so in that kind of a situation, the son, the survivor, should run to one of the cities of refuge. And there are 6 cities of refuge throughout the lands of Israel, 3 on the east side of the Jordan River and 3 on the west side. And so they can run to one of those cities and claim sanctuary until they are able to go to trial. And so here, this woman is giving her son sanctuary, and the people in the town are saying, we need to execute him for this murder. Now, so she's kind of stuck here because he's guilty. Like, she even, as she's telling the story, like, he did it, but he's also the last heir. And so to kill the last heir would mean that their family line would be wiped out, and their inheritance, the promise of God to this family, would be lost. And so the tie to the land, the tie to God's promise to inheritance, all of these things, tying to the law, this story is brilliant. Like, it's like, this is a really complicated issue, right, David? And it is a very complicated issue. And so, so she's telling the story, and as David is hearing this, I don't know why he's not realizing, like, hey, wait a second, this sounds awfully familiar. But he says he will bring justice on her behalf. Verse 9, but the woman from Tekoa said to him, let my lord the king pardon me and my family, and let the king and his throne be without guilt. The king replied, if anyone says anything to you, bring them to me, and they will not bother you again. She said, then let the king invoke the Lord, his God, to prevent the avenger of blood from adding to the destruction, so that my son will not be destroyed. And so the avenger of blood is the person who would be appointed by the town, the people, the family, to go and execute justice on the murderer. And so she's asking the king, to pardon the family. And he's like, okay, well, send him to me if there's a problem. Also, get the avenger of blood off our back, essentially, is what she's saying. And so she's working through all of the limits, all of the different elements of the law that apply to this case. And he says, as surely as the Lord lives, he said, not one hair on your son's head will fall to the ground. So he's promising that this son will live. Then the woman said, let your servant speak a word to my lord the king. Speak, he replied. The woman said, why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son. Like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be recovered, so we must die. But that is not what God desires. Rather, he devises ways so that a banished person does not remain banished from him. And now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I will speak to the king. Perhaps he will grant his servant's request. Perhaps the king will agree to deliver his servant from the hand of the man who is trying to cut off both me and my son from God's inheritance. And now your servant says, may the word of the Lord the king secure my inheritance, for my lord the king is like an angel of God in discerning good and evil. May the Lord your God be with you. Then the king said to the woman, don't keep from me the answer to what I am going to ask you. So he's like, just get to it. Jason paraphrased. Let my lord the king speak, the woman said. The king said, isn't the hand of Joab with you in all this? Like, I know who's orchestrating all of these things. It's Joab. The woman answered, as surely as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or the left from anything my lord the king says. Yes, it was your servant Joab who instructed me to do this and who put all these words into the mouth of your servant. Your servant Joab did this to change the present situation. My Lord has wisdom like that of an angel of God. He knows everything that happens in the land. So the plot has been revealed, and it is recognizing that Joab is orchestrating these things. Like this story, like there is no brothers that kill, like none of this is something that we are really going to zero in on and say, like, let's go to the case law. Is this a real thing? She's saying, like, yeah, Joab told me to do all of this because you respond to stories. David, you are like your wisdom, you are the king, like God is speaking through you, he works through you, your word is final. But you are creating this separation in the kingdom because you have banished your son and you have not brought him back. And so David is, he's a little slow on the uptake, but he is recognizing what's going on. And so he says, the king said to Joab, very well, I will do it. Go bring back the young man Absalom. Joab fell with his face to the ground to pay him honor, and he blessed the king. Joab said, today your servant knows that he has found favor in your eyes, my lord the king, because the king has granted his servant's request. Then Joab went to Geshur and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. But the king said, he must go to his own house. He must not see my face. So Absalom went to his own house and did not see the face of the king. So while he can come back, and while he's not going to be on trial for the murder of his brother, he is still in a exile in Jerusalem. So he can't come and see the king. And so there's still a separation here. Verse 25, in all Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut his hair once a year because it became too heavy for him. He would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. I mean, that's a lot of hair. And 3 sons and daughters were born to Absalom. His daughter's name was Tamar, and she became a beautiful woman. Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. Then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king, but Joab refused to come to him. So he sent a second time, but he refused to come. Then he said to his servants, look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab did go to Absalom's house, and he said to him, why have your servants set my field on fire? Absalom said to Joab, look, I sent word to you and said, come here so I can send you to the king to ask, why have I come to Geshur? It would be better for me if I were still there. Now then, I want to see the king's face, and I am guilty. If I'm guilty of anything, let him put me to death. So Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So Absalom is back in the town, and we get this description of him, like very handsome, rich, flowing hair, like Troy Pomalamu. How do you say his name? Anyway, he played for the Steelers. Just really a lot of hair, he is beloved by people, and like he's a charming person, and he's got his family, but he's still in exile, and we see that he's kind of a spoiled brat, right? It's like, hey, come see me, Joab, so that I can get word to the king. And Joab knows who his boss is, right? Like the main reason Joab is willing to be a sponsor for Absalom is because he sees how upset David is. David is grieving that there's this separation, and he wishes that he had some way to restore his family, but he can't. And so Joab concocts this whole scheme to get this woman to tell the story, to bring Absalom back. And David says, bring him back, but he's still got to be separated. And so Joab's like, well, I tried. And Absalom is not going to just let it go. And so he is living in the city for 3 years. And then finally he's like, I need Joab. So 2 tries to get his attention. So basically I sent you 2 emails and you didn't respond. So now I'm going to burn your field. Like that's one way to get people to actually do the thing you're asking them to do. That's one of the reasons why I don't have a field, because I'm terrible with email. Absalom convinces Joab to make an audience with the king, and finally comes, and David kisses him, and like as a way of saying like we are healed. You are my son, and you are back in the kingdom. But that's not really going to be enough for Absalom. And so the story continues. In chapter 15. We'll read through 12. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him. That's an important detail. He provided them for himself. David wasn't giving him these things. And why would the son of the king need chariots and 50 people running in front of him? Because he wanted to look like a king. He's already scheming, trying to present himself as more powerful and important than he actually is. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or a case could come to me, and I would see that they would receive justice." And so he is calling himself a man of the people. Nobody understands you like I understand you. Nobody can answer your questions like I can answer your questions. Nobody can solve these problems like I can solve your problems. I am the chosen one. Verse 5. Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. So he's not like, he's also trying to say, like, don't bow to me. He's keeping, like, reaching out and holding them is like, don't bow to me. Like, so he's trying to say, I'm on your level, even though he's the prince. He's not on their level. Like, he's the prince, but he's trying to be the populist leader that they're wanting him to be. Absalom behaved this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice. And so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living in Geshur in Aram, I made this vow. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron." The king said to him, "Go in peace." So he went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.'" 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. And so Absalom is for doing this 4-year popularity campaign to get the people to love him more and more. And at the end of the 4 years, he feels like he has a strong enough base to make his move. And his move is to go to Hebron, where David was first anointed king. But Hebron is also an ancestral site where Abraham, he bought the land for the burial plots. That's in Hebron. And so it's a very important city for the people of Israel and for the tribe of Judah in particular. And so for Absalom to come to David and say, "I need to go to Hebron to fulfill an oath to the Lord, to worship God there," that now is putting David in a place where if he were to say no, he would be getting in the way of Absalom's oath. And to keep somebody from fulfilling an oath is also a sinful thing to do. And so David is in a place where he's like, I can't really, if he's lying to me, what am I going to do? But if he's telling me the truth and he really made this vow and he's going to go worship in Hebron, then I need to let him do that. And so he is building his base, building his campaign, and is making his move that when the trumpets blow, the conspiracy throughout the land of Israel, the people will say, "Absalom is king in Hebron." And it all comes to pass. And all the people who went there to the party, the 200 men who were like, "Yeah, okay, let's go and celebrate with Absalom." I don't know, 7 years ago, Absalom did this and he killed his brother. So why is anybody going to Absalom's parties? That's the real question. Did you guys not hear about his last party? It did not go well. But they're with him. And so they go and they're like, "Oh, what's happening?" And, it's very easy to get swept up into a popular movement. And sometimes if we're not discerning, we might get stuck in something that we will later regret. And so these 200 people who went quite innocently had no idea what Absalom was going to do. But here they are now in this revolution in Hebron. So word gets to David in verse 13. A messenger came and said and told David, "The hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom," which is a real bummer. What? That's a surprise here for David. Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." Because David knows Absalom's ability to kill people. He's ruthless. So David recognizes, I let this happen. The king's officials answered him, "Your servants are ready to do whatever the Lord the king chooses." The king set out with his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at the edge of the city. All his men marched past him, along with the Kerethites and Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath marched before the king. So he's got quite an entourage that's moving with him. But he left these 10 concubines in the palace, and part of it is there are people who are there to care for the palace and to make sure that things are working. And so that it's not that he doesn't care for these people, but he also knows there's a responsibility to maintain continuity, because the palace would have had more than just the king living there. There was all kinds of people who would have been a part of the infrastructure, people who were not part of the royal family, who would work in the palace, who would make sure that, you know, horses were cared for, and all these different things. And so there's these concubines are there as part of that, like, continuity plan, is something that we should keep in mind. And so they stay, but he goes with his soldiers and these Kerethites, Pelethites, and Gittites, which are these just different people groups, they're not Jewish, they're not Hebrews, but they're affiliated with the king. Some of them are Philistines who have said, no, we want to be with you, David. And so they're going with him. Verse 19, the king said to Ittai the Gittite, why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with the king Absalom. You are a foreigner, an exile from your homeland. You came only yesterday, not literally yesterday, but like recently. And today shall I make you wander about with us when I do not know where I am going? Go back and take your people with you. May the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness. But Ittai replied to the king, as surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it be means life or death, there will your servant be. David said to Ittai, go ahead, march on. So Ittai the Gittite marched on with all his men and the families that were with him. The whole countryside wept aloud as the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on toward the wilderness. So Ittai is showing great loyalty. And there's an interesting notes here. And if your English translation has Ittai saying, the Lord, as the Lord lives, and if the Lord there is all caps, that is Ittai saying, as Yahweh lives. So this is a non-Hebrew person calling upon the name of the Lord and making a vow to David that wherever you go, by the name of Yahweh, I will be with you. And so this is an intense act of loyalty from a foreigner to be a part of the king's entourage and to be willing to die for the king. That's pretty awesome. And, you know, David doesn't seem to think he deserves that kind of loyalty, but Ittai is committed to David. And so they're making their way northwest at this point in Jerusalem. And so from Jerusalem, Zadok was there too, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the ark of the covenant of God. They set down the ark of God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Then the king said to Zadok, take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. The king also said to Zadok the priest, do you understand? Go back to the city with my blessing. Take your son Ahimaaz with you, also Abiathar's son Jonathan. You and Abiathar return with your 2 sons. I will wait at the fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. So Zadok and Abiathar took the ark of God back to Jerusalem and stayed there. So the ark of God traveling with you is a sign of like God's presence. And David is recognizing that all of these things are happening because of his failure. And so he says, like, I'm ready. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die. If God is trying to cast me from his presence, I understand. I'm ready for that. Go back to Jerusalem. You know, I secured this city to make this God's capital, like his favorite place on earth is going to be in here. The temple will be here eventually. Tabernacle is here. Go back and stay there. Take you, your son, Abiathar, and his sons, and serve there. Now, the wisdom here in what David is doing is he knows that Zadok and Abiathar are loyal to him. But now he's got some religious officials on the inside. So David is honest, but he's also shrewd. He's like, I need some people in Jerusalem to tell me what's happening. I need people to give me news. And so Zadok and Abiathar go. Verse 30, but David continued up the mountain of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. So David prayed, Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. And earlier, we're told that Ahithophel, these are hard names to say. In verse 15:12, David's counselor. So this is somebody who David had turned to for wisdom and advice and direction, is now loyal to Absalom. And so David's prayer is just, let this person be a fool. And the Lord will answer this prayer. It's kind of like when people pray for patience and humility. God's like, I'm on it. I will help you with that. You might not like the journey, but I'll help you with that. And so Ahithophel is going to, his counsel will turn to foolishness. Verse 32. When David arrived at the summit where the people used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him, his robe torn and dust on his head. So everybody who's recognizing what's happening is grieving. All of these things, the people are weeping, they're crying, David's head's covered, he's walking barefoot, it's all sad, it's heartbreaking. But then people like Hushai the Archite, they're already putting dust on their heads, their clothes are torn, they are grieving as well. And David said to him, if you go with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, your majesty, I will be your servant. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant. Then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. Won't the priests Zadok and Abiathar be there with you? Tell them anything you hear in the king's palace. Their two sons, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, and Jonathan, son of Abiathar, are there with them. Send them to me with anything you hear. So Hushai, David's confidant, arrived at Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city. So David is building a spy network on the inside. And these people are willing to do this because of their loyalty to David. And it's a risky thing to do. If they're found out, they'll be killed, but they're willing to take the risk. All right, let me make sure. I'm just going to go through here, see if there's something that I may want to highlight. I got so excited about these things that are happening that I didn't follow my notes at all. All right. Yeah, okay. Cool. All right. Chapter 17, we're going to work through verse 14. So, verse 1. When David had gone to a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. The king asked Ziba, why have you brought these? Ziba answered, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and fruits are for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who become exhausted in the wilderness. The king then asked, where is your master's grandson? Ziba said to him, he is staying in Jerusalem, because he thinks today the Israelites will restore to me my grandfather's kingdom. Then the king said to Ziba, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is now yours. I humbly bow, Ziba said. May I find favor in your eyes, my lord, the king. So Ziba is bringing gifts to David, saying, look, I'm loyal to you. That's there's more to this story. Just FYI, we'll see this in a little bit. But and because Mephibosheth isn't there, now remember, Mephibosheth, it can't walk. His travel would be hard and difficult. And so Ziba is here, Mephibosheth isn't. And the reason, David's son is turned against him this night. And so to hear that the grandson of Saul might be turning against him as well, totally believable. It's a totally believable story. And so he's all right, well, everything that I gave to Mephibosheth, I give to you. Like David has that level of, control that it's like, I will give this to you, on the account that I might come back to being king. Like right now, David can't do anything. But Ziba's like, oh, thank you so much. I gladly accept your generosity and your favor. But we will see. Ziba's story might not be entirely accurate. So Verse 5. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. So Mephibosheth, grandson of Saul, I'm going to get the kingdom back. Now this guy, Shimei, from the same clan of Saul, is cursing David as he goes by, like, your blood is on your hands, David, like that kind of stuff. And he pelted David and all the king's officials. So they're on two different sides of a ravine. So Shimei is cursing him from a distance. He's basically just tweeting at him. It's like a lot of courage behind that keyboard, my friend. So he pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given your kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer. So not great news. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king. Now Abishai is one of the mighty men, like the great warriors in the kingdom of Israel. And he's with him. He's like, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over there and cut off his head. It's like, I know how to shut him up, is how the paraphrase there. But the king said, what does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? So he's saying, like, maybe God sent him here to humble me. I don't know. David then said to Abishai and all of his officials, my son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself. So David leaves, and he leaves in shame and grief, and all of the people, it seems, are turning against him, but also he's got this cadre of folks, this entourage, these soldiers. The priests want to be with him. There's all these people who are saying, no, I'm with you, David. David is far from perfect, but he has a loyal group that is willing to walk with him through this exile. Now, David is an old man at this point. Like, he's not the young soldier that he was when he was on the run from Saul. He's a grandparent at this point, and he's out there now going to try to survive in exile. And, he's got more resources now than he did back then, but he doesn't have the same energy, the same vigor, but he also is carrying grief and loss because of his failure. His sin with Bathsheba led to all of these consequences. The sword will not depart your house. And this is what the Lord promised, and it is coming to pass. And so next week, we'll pick up on what's going on back in Jerusalem, and the conflict continues. David will be restored, but there will be even more grief to come in the coming passages. But that's what we'll stop this evening. Are there any questions in the room or online, or thoughts, anything in this passage where like, what is going on with this? Or anything stand out? No? All right. Well, y'all, there are times where we read the Bible and we're like, man, David is such a mighty man of God, man after God's own heart. But a man after God's own heart is not immune to grief. And, like we did a series in the life of David 2 summers ago, I think. And there were a lot of things that we kind of like summed up and jumped over, because, just because there's a lot, and going through like on a Sunday morning, like here's 14 verses in this larger narrative is really hard to do. And so, so I thank you for coming tonight and being a part of walking through a larger part to see how the whole story kind of fits together. Even then, we still have time constraints. So, all right, well, let's pray, and we will go on into the rest of the week. Lord, we thank you for your sustaining grace. We thank you, Lord, that even in our lives, we may encounter criticism. We may have enemies. We may have people who want the worst for us. And so, Lord, I pray that you would help us to hear your truth, hear your love, your mercy in all of that. Let's not look to the voices of the people who are trying to cast fear and doubt. Lord, help us to turn to you again and again. And maybe that's how we, even now, can be men and women after your own heart, by seeking you first. So help us to be advocates and to not delay justice when we can help bring justice, but in all things, Lord, help us to trust you. We love you, we worship you, we glorify you in all things. Amen.